We now continue our study of relatives. In part 2 of this tutorial on relatives, we'll look at the plurals and also the cases other than nominative and accusative. Here we have a sentence with plural subjects and relatives. The kings were brave. That's your main sentence. But there's a relative clause telling us more information about those kings. Namely, they are the kings qui ad proelium festina verunt, who hurried to battle. Qui is the nominative plural relative pronoun for masculine antecedents. Here's a feminine example. Reginae quae in urbe manebant occupatae erant. The queens were busy. What queens? The queens who were staying in the city. In your relative clause here, quae is the plural nominative referring back to a feminine antecedent. Here's neuter. Aedificia quoque pulchra sunt. The buildings are also beautiful. What buildings? The buildings quae alta sunt. The buildings which are tall. And quae is the plural relative going back to a plural antecedent in the neuter. Now, we can, as you know, have relatives that are objects within the relative clause. The boys were working there. Pueri ibi laborabant. What boys? Quos in horto vidisti. The boys whom you saw in the garden. Quos is the accusative plural relative pronoun going back to a masculine antecedent. It is the object of the verb vidisti, you saw. Here's feminine. Puellae ibi scribebant. The girls were writing there. What girls? The girls quas in tablino vidisti. The girls whom you saw in the study. Quas is the accusative plural relative pronoun referring back to a feminine antecedent. And here's neuter. Dona pretiosa erant. The gifts were precious. What gifts? The gifts quae pueris pater dedit. The gifts which the father gave to the boys. Quae is the nominative plural relative for a neuter antecedent. Now, we've looked at a lot of relatives, but I want you to also be aware that even though the relative can be the nominative or accusative, the subject or the object within its own clause, a nominative relative can refer to an accusative antecedent. Notice here in this main sentence, we saw a slave in the forum. That's the main sentence. The relative tells us more about the slave, but inside the relative, qui cum domino ambulabat, the relative is the nominative subject of the verb. So remember that relative clauses can have their own grammar independent of the main sentence. Now, another important point I want to make. In Latin, nouns have gender even though they aren't things that we, speaking English, logically consider masculine or feminine. House is a feminine noun. Because it's a feminine noun, it will take feminine relative pronouns when you need to have willam as the antecedent. And so even though I translated quam as whom when it was referring to the word regina, queen, when it's referring to willam, I'll translate it as which, and that's because of English usage. So the main sentence here is that the king had built a house. Which house? The house quam intravi, the house which I entered. And here for your reference are all the forms of the relatives, singular and plural, in the nominative and accusative. Notice, again, neuters always have the same form for the nominative and accusative. But also notice, again, that the nominative, singular, and plural are identical for both the masculine and the feminine. That will help you memorize these forms. Also notice that in the plural, these have the forms you would have expected for first and second declension nouns. Okay. In addition to nominative and accusative, relatives can occur in the other cases. Here's a sentence with a dative. Rex servo praemium dedit. The king gave a reward to the slave. Now I'm going to throw a relative clause with a dative in it. The main sentence here is that the servant was happy. Servus laetus erat. The relative includes a dative. Cui. Cui is your dative singular relative pronoun for all of the genders. Cui means to whom. So the slave to whom the king gave a reward was happy. Here's the plural. Quibus is the dative plural for all the genders. And so the slaves were happy. Servi laeti erant. The slaves quibus rex praemia dedit, to whom the king gave rewards. In the ablative, you'll usually see relative pronouns after prepositions. The main sentence here, servos in villa vidimus, we saw slaves in the house. Here I'm throwing a relative in the ablative. The house, villa, magna erat, the house was big. What house? Villa in qua servos vidimus, in which we saw the slaves. And you have your ablative case relative pronoun following the word in. And it will still be feminine, referring back to the feminine antecedent. Here's the plural. Villae erant antiquae. The houses were old. What houses? The houses aequibus servi festina verunt. The houses out of which the slaves hurried. And quibus is the ablative plural relative for all the genders. The genitive. Here's a sentence with a genitive. Amicus Marci in tablino scribebat. The friend of Marcus was writing in the study. Now we're going to throw in a relative with a genitive case relative pronoun. Marcus ate the food. That's your main sentence. Marcus ate the food. Marcus, cuius amicus in tablino scribebat. The friend of whom. Cuius is your genitive singular relative for all the genders. Of whom. Now, a better translation than of whom would be whose. So Marcus, whose friend was writing in the study, ate the food. And in the plural, milites tristes erant. The soldiers were sad. What soldiers? The soldiers quorum imperator in proilio mortuit. Whose emperor? Genitive plural. Whose emperor died in battle. Here finally are all of the forms of the relative pronouns in all of the cases, masculine, feminine, and neuter. You'll need to memorize these and be acquainted with how you translate them. But as I noted, there's a lot of repetition that can help you out. Notice that the dative singular is cui in all the genders. The genitive singular is cuius in all the genders. Quibus, quibus, quibus is everywhere in the dative plural and the ablative plural, and we noted the repetition in the masculine nominative and singular plural and the feminine nominative singular and plural there. So there you have the relative pronoun and clauses.